I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Dementia Matters. I'm here with our guest, Dr. Jason Karlawish, for installment number 2 of our discussion on the problem of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Karlawish is a fellow geriatrician and scientist at the Penn AD Core Center, as well as an avid writer and advocate for change for an aging population. In our last episode, we discussed the changing meaning of Alzheimer's disease and forms of cognitive impairment, as well as some of the pivotal moments in its history. On today's episode, we'll continue that conversation with a new twist, how culture, society, and politics played a role in how we got to where we are today, and the barriers that may have been put up or torn down in the process. Thanks for joining us again, Jason.
It's a pleasure to be back, Nate.
Let's jump into part 2 of your book called The Birth of Alzheimer's Disease. I suppose we can't really discuss history of Alzheimer's without touching on someone that you call the unwitting revolutionary.
Yes, Alois Alzheimer's. And I really liked writing part 2. It was the most fun to research. It was the most research intensive in writing. Alois Alzheimer's was preternaturally tall, even now. He'd be the tallest guy in the room. He was over 6 feet. He liked his beer. He came from a middle-class Catholic family. He sounds like he was a bit of a wild child, a wild young man. As I say, he liked his beer. Christian, but not, fairly low-key about it. In fact, his wife was Jewish. So his sister, anyway, I could go on. Anyway, he was an unwitting revolutionary because there was nothing about him that was disruptive. He was a good upper-middle-class German. Who married into wealth. But the discoveries he made, and when you read his writings, particularly his later writings, not the case report we all go to, the 1906-07 report, but when you read his later writings, he was seriously questioning the distinction between senile dementia and presenile dementia. In particular, he was questioning the idea that senile dementia was sort of end-stage aging, a host of just degenerative aging processes that medicine had little to say about, whereas presenile dementia was a disease, caused by some pathology. And you can see in his writings clearly that he said that there's something going on here. But then he died. And other events happened as well, because he wasn't alone in this work. In fact, I would argue he wasn't leading in this work. I don't want to sound rude, but I think he was more following,
And who was he following?
Well, I think one of the lead actors here in this was also a psychiatrist and also a neuropathologist named Oskar Fischer. And it's interesting. This was a cadre of psychiatrists that were very unique from other psychiatrists. They were not alienists. That is to say, they worked in asylums, which is the origin idea of an alienist, that they work in asylums that care for people who are outside of society. But these psychiatrists in Germany were very much enamored of biological models of mental illness and were keen to develop biological models. So they also were very skilled neuropathologists because they did clinical path correlations. Anyway, that's what Oskar Fischer was as well. And Fischer really pursued the study of brains of people with dementia. And he published several papers with meticulous microscopic analyses of what we would now call amyloid plaques, but which at the time, given the quality of his work, were actually called Fischer's plaques and named after Fischer. And I think they should be renamed after Fischer to honor him, because his story is very sad, and his story becomes an entry into what happened and what's so wrong. If Alois Alzheimer's and his colleagues had been allowed to do what they were doing, I think that it is possible by the middle of the 20th century, we would have seen the biological underpinnings of what then was called senility. Okay, but that didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? It was because they were all in Germany and German nationals, and everything was going fairly swimmingly up until about 1914 when World War I hits, and then things really start to fall apart. And in the 4 years of the war, and in the aftermath of that war, and the economic chaos, it would make doing research extremely difficult because it's very expensive. But it gets even worse. Fischer actually lived in Austria. He lived in Prague. I'm sorry, and he lived in Prague in Czechoslovakia. I'm sorry, and he was Jewish and he was a leftist. And in 1920s, being a leftist Jew was perilous, and he would be driven out of his university appointment, and he would therefore be unable to pursue his research. And he ultimately would be imprisoned when the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, and he would be and was killed in Thysenstadt prison by the Gestapo. And so it was a career cut short and ruined. And his story is one of, sadly, too many. Essentially, there would have been great progress in the field of Alzheimer's disease, but for World War One, German nationalism, economic collapse, anti-Semitism, and then World War II sort of tops it all off, and it just shut the whole thing down. And that's a story that I wanted to tell, and I think it's a very important story. And there it is.
No, thank you for that because it's an ugly side of it, but I think I do feel like it's an important thing to know, and it does answer some of the questions of why has it taken so long for us to get to where we are. It seemed like the German scientists and physicians were making great progress in Alzheimer's disease. What happened?
The other wrap on this, which I point out, is so the champion of the concept of biological psychiatry was a German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin. And in his day, Emil Kraepelin was to psychiatry as William Osler was to internal medicine. And yet we all remember William Osler, more or less, maybe. But Kraepelin was utterly forgotten. And why is that? Well, Kraepelin would embrace vicious eugenic concepts. After the First World War, he became a anti-Semite. And I'm not saying that was the reason why his work was ignored and forgotten, but it certainly was a reason because it got wrapped up in the bundle of dark nationalism that was wrecked by by the Nazis. And so that just adds to this story of it wasn't about science not making progress. It wasn't. It was about society intruding into science and the scientists themselves, in the case of Kraepelin, being seduced by these dark forces.
Now, if we fast forward a bit and change the scenery to that of the United States, you describe many key cultural and political events that influence Alzheimer's disease from the 1970s to the early 2000s. And I'd like to start with a call to action in the form of an essay that was written in 1976 that you describe. What was this and why did it matter?
Yeah. So you're not going to let me talk about the fact that from about 1950 to 1976, Freudism basically ruled psychiatry.
Well, you just did now, so you got it in.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, that's what also kept it hidden in America, which was Freudian theories of disease really crowded out biological theories. And I'm not saying Freudian theories are wrong and biological are right, but it really kind of crowded out biological psychiatry. Anyway, yeah, you're right. A key event then happens in 1976, and it was a short 1,200 word essay by a smart, hardworking, not terribly prominent for his research. In fact, a neurologist named Robert Katzman. And he wrote this essay called The Prevalence and Malignancy of Alzheimer's Disease. And citing a few studies, it's only a few references and whatnot, he argues that the thing we call senility is the same as this thing we called Alzheimer's, namely that this rare pre-senile dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease is the same thing as this very common dementia caused by senility, that is to say, extreme aging. And he principally cites the results of microscopy studies of what we would call the Fisher. We was once upon the Fisher's plaques, but at that point was thought to be and came to be discovered to be amyloid plaques. And that's essentially his argument. And what he says is, if it's actually a prevalent and malignant killer, we have to take this problem on and bring the full force of biomedicine to bear, in order to research it, diagnose it, and develop treatments for it. And I detail the Katzman story. I was able to interview both of his sons. And he was a fascinating man, and a very thoughtful person who actually probably also could have been a great social scientist because he really thought broadly and deeply and across disciplines. And he also was a bit of an activist. He was recruited to take a job in Arkansas, but he wasn't convinced that by the time he would get there that the state would be desegregated. and he didn't have any interest in practicing medicine in a segregated state. And he himself had witnessed the devastation of Alzheimer's in a beloved mother-in-law, and understood how much it destroyed a family, or harmed a family, I should say. So he had personal as well as political motivations. I mean, I think he saw this disease as robbing people's autonomy and liberty. And he's a fascinating man. Anyway, the essay was the sort of shot heard around the world, and it would launch and organize a variety of efforts, and he would be part of all those efforts, like, namely the founding of what would then become called the Alzheimer's Association, NIA's research focus, et cetera. Katzman was there.
And I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk about Freudian psychiatry too with this question. So three other key things happened around the time leading up to the essay and the essay itself, that I think build important context, and you've alluded to one of them, which is psychiatry was changing, but also the system of care for older people was reforming, and then the role of women was advancing. So what did those three things do in the realm of Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, it's a bit of a tangled knot, and to unpack it is interesting. So, number one, biological psychiatry began to replace Freudian ideas of psychiatry. And I'm not saying there's anything, quote, fundamentally wrong with psychodynamic theories of illness, but they don't explain all illness. And they dominated American psychiatry almost to the point of excess, if you will. By the 1970s, certainly by the 80s, that balance began to tip, you could argue, arguably in the wrong direction, even to the degree that we sort of reject any psychodynamic theories. Anyway, that gave space for understanding a disease of the brain as a biological disease. So suddenly dementia had a place. So that's one event. The other event is the American family was changing. The notion that there are these large, closely together families with enough women who, of course, will do all the care because that's what women do, just simply wasn't working anymore. The size of the family was shrinking. It was spread out. But more importantly, really, the story of Alzheimer's disease in the 20th century is in some sense the story of women. Because what began to happen over the 20th century was a recognition that women's ability to exercise their autonomy was not being adequately respected. And my mother remembers not being able to get a credit card in 1961 because her husband had to give her credit. She couldn't just walk in and get a credit card. And I mean, you could tell there's endless stories. So what was happening by 1976 when Katzman published his essay was a recognition that, there are societal structural segregation in place that keep people from living the lives they want to live. And we have to undo and disimpact those structural barriers. Like once upon a time, jobs could only were listed by gender in the newspapers, jobs for men, jobs for women. And a woman couldn't apply for a men's job and, vice versa, let alone be hired. Well, all that ended with Supreme Court cases. The point I make is America was becoming ready to see something that takes away your ability to self-determine your life should be thought of as a disease because it is so fundamentally antithetical to being a human, as opposed to just being part of nature and that's just the way things are. So that's another cultural stream. And then tied into that then is the sort of assumed workforce of stay-at-home, ever-present. There'll always be some daughter-in-law, second daughter who hasn't quite got it, whatever, to care for people. That's just not appropriate anymore. And so what you're left with, well, then who's going to take care of these folks? Well, the reality is, of course, it still is women, and in this country, sadly, unsupported. But there was a brief period of time in the 80s where there was some consensus that we need to rejigger our healthcare system to provide long-term care services and supports for the chronically disabled. But then that's the last sort of actor in the story. And in the book, I have a chapter, Last Casualties of the Cold War and Crisis in the Family, where I talk about the rapid, and it was rapid, it was over about 10, 15-year period at most, collapse of any consensus that we should have a long-term care social insurance program in America. And I chronicle how the pivot point was around 1988. And certainly the window closed once the Gingrich Congress came into power. And even now, that's the world we live in. I mean, any proposal to vastly expand social services and supports is met by one party as socialism and just a no-go, and that's where we're stuck right now.
And we'll talk about that actually in episode 4. We'll ask you for more questions on it.
Yeah.
In your part 2, though, you also spend some time telling the stories of some pretty influential people who were focused on Alzheimer's disease and caregiving. And in those sections, you describe an internal struggle over a name. And so that's reflective of more than just the name. It's really reflective of the field itself. So could you tell our listeners, what was that struggle?
Yeah, the struggle was what to name the organization, which we now call the Alzheimer's Association, and it reflected, and I detail almost month to month, that as the quote 7 families got together, what they were going to call themselves. So the 7 families, as they're known, were 7 separate groups that had sprung up throughout America in the 70s. To take on the problem of dementia, the problem of Alzheimer's. And right there, you see the problem. Because most of these groups were organized by women who were trying to care for husbands who had dementia. And they were encountering a different healthcare system that just said, well, I don't know, it's aging, you take care of them, it's your problem. And their stories are utterly moving. And I detail one in particular, Hilda Pridgian, who cared for her husband. I was able to interview her son, Ryan. It was a very moving interview. Anyway, so everyone agrees we've got to do something, but then the question is what's our approach? And is our approach that we need to take care of the problem of dementia, or is our approach that we need to take care of the problem of Alzheimer's? And if it's the problem of dementia, we're open to the fact that Alzheimer's is one cause, but there are many causes, etc. And we have to advocate for the care and treatment of those folks. But if the problem is Alzheimer's, well, it's the biggest cause, we think. Back then, that was what the rhetoric was. And that gives us a focus on research to find the cure, et cetera. And politically, that side argued that Congress would be more amenable to an approach that emphasized this one disease, as opposed to a disease of the month coming at Congress every time saying, we're the disease about dementia, the head injury people. No, we are the Alzheimer's people. No, we are the Parkinson's people. No, we are. And Congress would be getting mixed messages. Like, well, so this was the fight. And the compromise was to name the organization the Alzheimer's Disease and Related Disorders Association, which is what their actual still incorporated name is. If you go back at what they file as their taxes is the ADRD. Because that was what I call the Bethesda compromise. And I detailed the fights that broke out. And they were fights. They got angry. I mean, they were yelling at each other about this. And in some sense, because they were in this argument about who do we care about? Anyway, certainly, though, what would happen about 4 or 5 years later, the Alzheimer's Association would officially announce that our public-facing name is the Alzheimer's Association. And that way we are advocating for Alzheimer's disease, the diagnosis, treatment, and ultimately cure of this disease. And that tension still, I think, exists in the field, though. What's our focus? And you see it now played out in NAPA, for example, the National Alzheimer's Plan.
And so culture and society weren't the only influences on Alzheimer's disease. So politics played an important role too, which you cover in your book. So what do you think were the key moments in our U.S. political history that positively or negatively affected the progress of Alzheimer's disease?
In the U.S. political history, it's mostly negative up until the 21st century, this century, when, and I detail how the Alzheimer's Association kind of rejiggered their strategy completely and really did some marvelous work with Congress. And but much of the latter quarter of the 20th century is a series of just fits and starts and disasters. And it begins with the election of Ronald Reagan. Reagan didn't set out to say, I want to hurt people with Alzheimer's and their family members. He didn't. But the rhetoric he advanced and the policies he pursued were not going to help improve the diagnosis and treatment of persons living with dementia. He walked into the office saying, the government is big, bloated, overregulated, America is overtaxed. He, particularly in his State of the Union addresses, would cite Medicare and Medicaid as full of waste and corruption and not in need of expansion, but in need of reduction and cutting. And so the notion of, well, let's put a long-term care social insurance program in place was just that. It was just a non-starter. Having said that, by 1988, there was consensus that we need to do something about the problem of long-term care in America. The problem was that the one candidate, as I detail, who didn't support that view was George Herbert Walker Bush. And he, of course, would go on to win the election. And then things by the 90s get messy. And the key events that I detail there, and I actually have a very vivid encounter where Tom DeLay meets these Alzheimer's activists. And he would, of course, at the time he was just a congressman from Texas, he would, of course, become the majority whip when the Gingrich Congress took over. And I detail from the Alzheimer's Association's board of director minutes, which I had access to, how they recognize that the political sentiments here are in no way going to support a vast expansion of social insurance programs that we need. So by the time the 20th century rolls around, the best that the field can do is fits and starts of small advances in programs, which really were just sort of a patchwork of a mess. And then there's a whole story, which I narrate, of the frustrations of getting the necessary increases in research funding for the National Institutes of Aging. And that story, ultimately in the 21st century with the National Alzheimer's Project, that's a brilliant story. I have a whole chapter called Hope and a Plan, where the Alzheimer's Association really rejiggered their approach and engaged in some of the most, I think, sort of thoughtful advocacy. It's really an inspiring story.
And you've said in the past that we didn't have to be in this crisis that we're currently in.
Yeah.
So where do you think we went wrong, and why has it taken us so long in the United States to grapple with this disease?
Because I think Alzheimer's disease is wrapped up in late 20th century fights over the role of the family, expressed through fights about family values, the role of the state and concerns about the welfare state in America, wrapped up into concerns about creeping socialism. And, that kind of hot rhetoric really thwarts the ability to organize for a disease so vast and enormous as this disease. I mean, on the day we're talking, the Alzheimer's Association's issued its facts and figures for 2021. And the facts are there's 6.2 million people with the disease and 11 million caregivers. Well, we have not been able to have the kind of conversation as a society that says what kind of infrastructure needs to be in place to take care of these kinds of patients and their caregivers. And it is about infrastructure, like the way we think about roads and bridges. And I brought that up specifically because we can't even have a conversation in this country about how to repair bridges at this point, and how to spend our national money on repairing roads and bridges, let alone creating a long-term care social support system. Although I do have hope that I think the COVID pandemic may have opened us up to some changes in that space, because we sort of realize how important it is to have systems of care in place when they're taken away, as COVID showed us.
Now, why is it more than just a medical problem? And as you describe it in your book, Alzheimer's disease is a humanitarian problem or crisis.
Yeah. Well, it starts with this recognition that it chips away early and relentlessly at someone's ability to self-determine their life. And so it ramifies into things like the organization and structure and function of the family, someone's ability to exercise their self-determination and choose the life they want to live. It ramifies into your ability to exercise your instrumental activities of daily living, to sound like a geriatrician, shopping, using technology, et cetera. And so it's so much wrapped up into our daily lives that it requires an approach that, frankly, is wrapped up in our daily lives. And I talk in the book about things like changes in our how we talk to patients and think about capacity, the use of technology to detect and monitor cognitive problems. Well, once you see the disease with that ethical framing, you really see it's a humanitarian problem.
You've said in the past we can't drug our way out of this disease. Why do you think that? And do you think Alzheimer's disease is not just one disease?
It requires sort of a full panoply of our resources: law, economics, social science, and yes, of course, biomedical science. I guess the one sticker there is, well, what if you could cure it? Then we wouldn't have this problem, right? And that's so a key point that I make in the book is, I think what you and I know whenever we go to our meetings, once the door is closed, everyone says this is a heterogeneous disease, and the notion that we're going to sort of cure it is like trying to cure cancer. I mean, there are many different routes with which brains suffer neurodegeneration. Amyloid plaques, tau tangles are just two of them. And so, yeah, we should count on better treatments, but the notion that we're going to drug our way out of this disease is like, buying lottery tickets to plan for your retirement. You may win big, but the odds are you're not going to win.
So I'm going to remind our listeners that the FDA is currently deciding on whether to approve a new potential therapy for people with Alzheimer's disease called aducanumab. Now, this would be the first approval of a new drug since 2003. However, this is not the first time we're searching for hope in a pill, as Dr. Karlawish describes in his book about a different class of drugs. So, Jason, what happened with the first set of drugs that we call cholinesterase inhibitors, and can we find hope in a pill today?
I'll answer your second question. Yes, we can find hope in a pill, but it needs to be measured hope. Having said that, the cholinesterase inhibitors, which we all now know as, donepezil, marketed by Pfizer as Aricept, galantamine, rivastigmine, et cetera. The cholinesterase inhibitors I detail in a chapter called Hope in a Pill, the sort of headline-making research report that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine around Thanksgiving or just before Thanksgiving in the late 1980s, of a therapy that seemed to restore people back to the way they were. And the bottom line, what I detail, and then I sort of fast forward to the early 21st century when a prominent French researcher is interviewed about the cholinesterase inhibitors and admits on a hot mic, "Ils ne servent rien." They're useless. It translated into the English. And I found the link to the interview on what's the equivalent of an NPR station in France, a show called France Interdit. And his sentiment was an honest sentiment. You could debate whether they're useless, but certainly the hype and the promise of the cholinesterase inhibitors, I think now most admit, were way overplayed and way misunderstood. And yet they were overplayed and they were misunderstood. And so the question is why, And essentially the argument I make in that chapter is a couple streams of events were occurring, but I'll highlight two. Number one, it gave the disease a biomedical model upon which research could be conducted and studies done where there were prior no clinical studies being done. And number two, it created a research infrastructure. And so you mentioned aducanumab, the research infrastructure in place that allows Biogen to do the studies it did to develop aducanumab, you can trace that right back to the cholinesterase inhibitors. Because what the cholinesterase inhibitors did was lead to an infusion of federal money into the Alzheimer's centers to develop the research infrastructure to do the clinical trials. And so, it's an interesting story of how sometimes drugs have other secondary gains. Namely, they build a research infrastructure, which is certainly what the cholinesterase inhibitors did.
Well, I appreciate your perspective on this, Jason, and thank you for providing the context needed as we delve into our healthcare system and what society can do, what we can do to help the problem of Alzheimer's disease.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Nate, for having me.
Please subscribe to Dementia Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts. And rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. The Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center combines academic, clinical, and research expertise from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health and the Geriatric Research Education and Clinical Center of the William S. Middleton Memorial Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. It receives funding from private university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes of Health for Alzheimer's Disease Centers. This episode was produced by Rebecca Wasilewski and edited by Bashir Adine. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. Check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.